Since ancient times, clean water has made or broken entire civilizations. Armies have won and lost wars over it. And today, our water is even more vulnerable. It can be contaminated with microbes, microplastics, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, and even nuclear particles. Now let me ask you a question. How much water do you think you use in a single day? Drinking, cooking, bathing, cleaning? Just the basics. Take a guess. Europeans use an average of 144 liters or 38 US gallons per day, with Slovaks coming in on the low end at 78 liters per day and the Swiss consuming 300 liters per day. Australians, at least in Sydney, use roughly 200 liters or 53 US gallons each day. In the US, each person uses an average of 310 liters or about 82 gallons each day. Even in Ghana, West Africa, they use an estimated 50 liters or around 13 US gallons per person per day. That's just for the 5 basics and doesn't factor in things like irrigation or recreation. It's no stretch of the imagination to say that any sudden loss of water will be a shock to your everyday lifestyle. And without prior planning, an event where normal water access is lost, even for 24 hours, can quickly become a panicked search. If you don't know where to look, and you don't understand the threats that can be hiding in even the cleanest looking water, things can go from bad to life-threatening very quickly. But with a bit of planning and minimal investment, what would be a reactionary panic can instead be strategic actions to quickly overcome problems, help others, and avoid making a bad situation significantly worse. That's what we'll be talking about today. First, we'll talk about how much of a water reserve you should have available. Then we'll discuss what counts toward hydration and what doesn't, before moving on to a brief overview of each of the health threats, different sources of water, and the things you should consider before deciding if you should get water from them. We'll wrap up by discussing the different ways to make contaminated water safe, or at least come out with an understanding of what it can be used for if we can't drink it. And finally, end by giving a plan for a simple, portable, affordable filter system that should work well enough for almost any situation. Before we go on, I want to make a disclaimer. I've done my best to thoroughly research and present this topic. However, I can make mistakes and new information might become available. The Russian proverb, trust but verify, serves as well here as anywhere. As always, sources are linked in the description. So with that out of the way, let's get into it. Before you decide how much emergency drinking water to keep on hand, let's first take a look at how much water you normally need based on your level of activity and the climate where you live. According to the World Health Organization, each person needs 2.5 to 3 liters per day of drinking water for emergencies. But this recommendation is good for at most a day or maybe 2 in a temperate climate and doesn't allow for physical activity. So unfortunately, this recommendation is barely adequate for basic hydration and risks turning an uncomfortable situation into a life-threatening one. But to get a realistic number isn't rocket science. You can calculate how much water each person needs if you take half of your body weight in pounds and drink that amount in ounces of water, and add 12 ounces of water to your daily intake for every 30 minutes of physical activity or spent in a hot environment. I've put both the international and the US equations on the screen for your reference. Even if you're in a cooler climate, you need to be prepared to sweat it out, quite literally, if something happens during the hot summer or you need to do a lot of physical activity. According to our equation, we need at least 4.7 liters per day for men, 4.3 liters per day for women, and 2.5 liters per day per child. For those in the US, every time you hear liters, just replace it with quarts to get basically the same result. As far as water requirements for pets, unfortunately, I couldn't find an equation that could account for the difference between a water-sipping Chihuahua and the oversized boxer that insists on making a slip and slide on the floor every time it passes the water bowl. I'll leave it to you to do your own research on how much water you need to store for them. It's also worth bearing in mind that these recommendations are for healthy individuals. Anyone suffering from diarrhea, dysentery, having burns, bleeding, or is pregnant or breastfeeding will need more. Breaking it down simply for those who just want the numbers without all the math, a 3-day supply for a husband, wife, and 2 children would be 43 liters or just under 12 US gallons. That's small enough that you could stash it away under a bed or in a small apartment closet. Now that we've figured out how much water you need, let's take a look at what contributes to hydration and what doesn't. Your 72-hour supply of drinking water is a great starting point, but it's unlikely to be the only source of water in your house. In fact, there are plenty of alternatives that you can turn to without having to start sipping from the toilet. Spoiler alert. Milk, decaf tea and coffee, electrolyte drinks, fruits and vegetable juices, yogurts and creams, soup, broth, smoothies, fruits, especially melons, which are around 90% water, vegetables, and even melted ice from your freezer. If your refrigerator or freezer are off, prioritize items that will spoil first, like milk and yogurt. Oh, and don't be that person that tries to chug a large bottle of milk only to predictably lose all of that would-be hydration. The liquid from canned vegetables is always good. Just as a side note, frozen items can be cooked and eaten as they thaw. Many Americans in hurricane zones will be familiar with the idea of a hurricane party where people in the neighborhood get together and cook and share everything that is about to spoil rather than throwing it out. There are also some things that you should avoid when you're trying to stay hydrated. Sugary drinks and sodas, including diet and sugar-free varieties, as well as alcoholic beverages, including beer and mixed drinks, all contribute to dehydration. It's here that I want to dispel a perennial myth that I've seen demonstrated by experts on television survival shows. That's drinking your own urine. It's just a bad idea. Don't do it. Just don't. Military survival manuals, doctors, and most experts agree that it's gross. But more importantly, it gives you no hydration and puts all that stuff back that your body just worked hard to remove. There's also one more on this list that I'm sure I'll get a lot of hate over, and that's caffeine. I realize that getting between someone and their bean juice or cuppa is a great way to lose friends, but hear me out. There's a lot of confusion surrounding caffeine. Many sources claim it contributes to dehydration, and as many others claim that it doesn't. And it's here that context really matters because both arguments are correct. Most research indicates that the water content in a caffeinated drink balances against the mild dehydrating effect of caffeine, meaning that if you have a cup, the caffeine causes you to lose about the same amount of water as it contains. So basically you break even. In everyday situations when water is plentiful, it isn't a problem since you make up for that by drinking more water. But when you're dealing with a limited supply of drinking water, anything that uses your precious reserves and doesn't contribute to hydration ends up being a net loss. So while that cup of brew might be a great morale boost, you have to go into it knowing that unless you're able to source more drinkable water, you're trading a quick pick-me-up now for a potentially much-needed cup of water later. Another thing to keep in mind is that certain foods require more water to digest. When water is limited, try to avoid eating lots of protein and excess salt, as both will make you use more water. I'm sure if you listen close, you can hear all of the Americans and Australians in the chat let out a collective groan. Okay, let's assume that for whatever reason the water stays off. Your stored reserves are gone and you need to find more water. The norm is for people to assume that they will just go down to the store and get some bottled water. But anyone who has been through a major disaster will tell you that stores will not be able to stock enough water even when they have more than a week beforehand to bring in extra stock. And getting anything after the event assumes that deliveries can even get to your area, which is a terrible assumption since they often cannot. Your plan must not assume that you can get water from the store or aid center. So then where should you look and what hazards might be lurking in those sources? It's here that situational context is vital. Before you get water from any source, consider anything in the immediate area and upstream that might be contaminating it. There's a huge difference between getting water from a mountain stream because the electricity is off and getting water downstream from a chemical spill or flooded sewage plant. The first and most accessible source of clean water is in your pipes. Just because the water isn't flowing anymore doesn't mean it's totally gone. Try going to the lowest level of the building and opening your tap. Assuming that you don't live in a certain U.S. city in Michigan, any water you get from there will be safe to drink. Garden hoses might have some usable water trapped inside them, but be careful since water that sits in them, especially during hot weather, will contain high concentrations of lead. It's probably safe enough to drink in an emergency, and it's certainly good enough as an option for other uses besides drinking. Also, the reservoir on the back of many toilets contains drinkable water, assuming no chemicals like a bleach tablet were added to clean the tank. And even if bleach has been added to the tank, you can still use that water for other things. If you're unsure about the water, it's a wise idea to filter it, just in case. Another large and safe source of water is a hot water tank. The same filtering rules apply, but with 2 additional notes of caution. Hot water tanks often have mineral buildup that causes the water to come out a brown-orange color when drained. While this isn't appetizing, these minerals have always been in your water and they're not harmful. A simple straining filter will probably remove the worst bits, but it's not necessary. A second note of caution here might seem obvious, but the water in your hot water tank is hot. Modern hot water tanks can keep the water dangerously hot for days even after being turned off, so I recommend using the water as a last resort. If you need to use it, be prepared to handle it very carefully. Another source that many people consider are swimming pools. It makes sense. It's a massive, well-maintained reserve of water. At first glance, it would seem like an excellent source of emergency water. And for bathing, washing, cleaning, and flushing toilets, it is. But despite what many online commenters might suggest, this water should not be considered safe to drink except in the most dire circumstances, even during emergencies. Why? The typical amount of chlorine in a pool should be between 1 and 3 parts per million, which is below the 4 parts per million level that is recommended to make water safe to drink according to the U.S. Center for Disease Control. But chlorine isn't the problem, since waiting a few days or aerating the water by pouring it several times between 2 containers will remove most of it. The real hidden threat is a cyanic acid and other chemicals found in most pools today. They're added as a chlorine stabilizer agent in cleaners. They don't break down over time and build up until they're diluted with fresh water. The recommended level of cyanic acid, according to pool experts, is between 30 and 50 parts per million. However, studies have shown that exposure to water with even 10 parts per million for as little as 4 weeks can lead to anxiety and depression-like behavior. That's not something you want to deal with anytime, but it's especially not something you want clouding your judgment during an emergency situation. Even if you have a pool that uses an ionizer and UV filter instead of chlorine, the water still contains other chemicals and heavy metals and is not considered safe to drink. Another thing to keep in mind is that outdoor pools can be exposed to chemicals and radioactive fallout from the air, rain, and snow, and may become completely unusable as a water source if they become contaminated. But you might ask, won't using an activated charcoal filter remove those chemicals? The answer is yes, but the amount of activated charcoal needed is unrealistically high, and even then has a limited effect even after multiple passes through the filter. I wasn't able to get reliable numbers on how much activated carbon it would take to filter out pool chemicals or its efficacy, so I can't recommend using it. If you think that you have better information, feel free to join in the discussion in the comments. Reverse osmosis is the only reliable filtering method for making pool water safe to drink. So basically, a pool is a great water reserve for everything except drinking. Before deciding if rainwater is drinkable or even usable, you first need to consider what might be in the air. A large industrial fire, chemical spill, wildfire, volcano, dust from mines and construction sites, or even a nuclear explosion or nuclear leak could be wafting large amounts of contaminants into the air dozens or even hundreds of miles away. And those contaminants are now potentially depositing a layer of toxic chemicals, heavy metals, volcanic ash, and or nuclear fallout onto your roof and the roof of every building downwind. Then, when it rains, these wash off the roof along with the water that you would hope to use. Volcanic and radioactive rainout can happen weeks after the initial event, with ash remaining in the high atmosphere. You also need to remember that as rain falls through that air, it will pick up those contaminants and carry them to the ground. This phenomenon is known as rainout and is most commonly associated with nuclear war, but it applies to any event that creates airborne contaminants. So is it safe to collect rainwater when deadly poison isn't literally raining from the sky? Well, consider what other things land on your roof. Birds like to fly over and have a habit of leaving deposits everywhere they go. These wash off in the rain along with salmonella and E. coli that they may contain. In addition to that, mold and waterborne pathogens from stagnant gutter water can be washed out and they make their new home in your cistern. One way to mitigate this is to divert an initial portion of the water away. This method is called the first flush. Most of the contaminants will be washed away in the first 25 liters or so that have left the downspout, but this can vary depending on the surface area of the roof. If you are up to this, calculate or guess how much water is needed to clean out the initial crud. Or you can take a more hands-on approach and hang a tarp or sheet of plastic and collect rain that way. If you hang it up right before the rain starts in an open area, you can be pretty confident that it is free of pathogens. There's still a risk of chemical and nuclear rainout during the storm, so keep this in mind as you consider the safety of your rainwater. Once the rain is collected, it's still a good idea to filter it. Snow will have the same concerns, but will collect more contaminants since it stays in the air longer and doesn't have that same washing away effect as rain. Once it's melted, treat it like rainwater. And remember, kids, never eat ice or snow directly. It will drop your core body temperature and cause more problems than being thirsty. Oh, and always, always be extra careful not to get that yellow kind. Bodies of fresh water like lakes, rivers, streams, ponds, and swamps are what most people think about when they need to get water that isn't from a tap or bottle. But these sources are also the most vulnerable to contamination. Even the cleanest naturally harbor pathogens like Giardia, Cryptosporidium, bacteria, and viruses. But they are vulnerable to much more. I would argue that they are the most vulnerable water source. According to the U.S. Coast Guard, Hurricane Katrina caused a reported 540 chemical spills. Hurricane Ida had over 2,000 spills reported. During Hurricane Ian, the reported amount of chemicals in the waterways was so bad that it could be seen flowing into the ocean from space for days. And while the majority of those spills were noted as small, during Hurricane Katrina, an estimated 8 million U.S. gallons of petroleum products were spilled. For comparison, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, which is considered the second largest spill in U.S. history, released an estimated 10 million gallons. In another incident during Hurricane Ian, 2,300 gallons of sodium hypochlorite, also known as highly concentrated bleach, spilled onto the ground. Thankfully, this particular spill was contained within the facility and there were no lasting effects, but it could easily have washed downstream. Another potential source of contamination is nuclear. Worldwide, at least 5 active and 1 deactivated nuclear power plant have flooded between 2005 and 2025, risking leaks of radioactive feedwater, radioactive runoff, and core meltdowns when the safety mechanisms flood out, like what happened to the Fukushima reactors. Even aging infrastructure and neglect can lead to contamination, as people in the UK found out when burst pipes dumped radioactive water into Loch Long. In addition, there are also thousands of mine sites worldwide, many undocumented, with radioactive waste piles that could easily just wash away. Now, nuclear contamination as a threat is a bit difficult to pin down because events and types are so variable, but here are some broad takeaways. The vast majority of radioactive contaminants are bound into particles larger than bacteria, or about 0.1 microns, and can be removed with some filtering. However, other compounds containing radioactive iodine, strontium, cesium, and uranium, those isotopes found most commonly in nuclear reactors, will dissolve in water. But even those can be mostly removed using some filtering. If you suspect water is contaminated with radioisotopes, then you should use it as a last resort until an expert with proper testing equipment can confirm that it's safe. Earthquakes are also known to cause major waterway contamination problems by rupturing storage tanks, sewage lines, and generally breaking stuff. An example of this was in 2010 when a magnitude 7.0 earthquake struck 25 kilometers to the west of the Haitian capital, Port-au-Prince. Water lines were ruptured, cutting off clean water to most of the city. Sewage, which was already a problem, collected in the ditches and canals. The daily rains then washed this toxic elixir into the rivers and canals where people were now forced to get their water. These conditions conspired to cause the second worst cholera outbreak in hundreds of years after that disease was accidentally introduced by an aid worker camp with poor sanitation conditions. Over 10,000 people died and 800,000 suffered from the illness. Other potential contaminants in waterways include pharmaceuticals, volcanic ash deposits, ash from large industrial fires and wildfires, illegal dumping, agricultural runoff, toxic algae, and chemical and heavy metal runoff from flooded out industrial sites and mines. Open wells are also susceptible to flooding and all of the problems we just mentioned. Be sure to carefully consider what contamination might be nearby before you decide to get your water from there. All the same filtering methods apply. Another method for getting water is to dig a hole in low-lying wet areas. These seeps, as they are called, will slowly fill with water that you can then collect and filter. Depending on their location, these could be almost drinkable unfiltered, but other locations could have heavy contamination. It's best just to assume that they are contaminated and filter them. Springs are typically a great source of clean water and in many cases are drinkable without filtering. They are, however, more vulnerable to nearby chemical spills, mining, oil drilling, and especially nuclear contamination. So if you're in doubt about the water quality, you will want to look elsewhere. That said, growing up, I lived near an artesian spring that gushed out of the ground, and the community would regularly get clean, drinkable water from it year-round, even in freezing weather. Despite oil fracking and agricultural byproducts constantly being in the area, it always passed the safety test by a wide margin. But I would also be remiss not to mention that every artisanal spring studied in the Chernobyl exclusion zone was contaminated with fallout and are still considered unsafe and unfit for drinking decades later. Deep wells, such as those found in many rural areas, are one of the best sources of clean water. As long as they have been maintained correctly, they will be safe. However, flooded water can get in them and make them unsafe to drink. Also, if heavy nuclear fallout has settled nearby, some radioisotopes may build up in the groundwater in the following months. It is estimated that a year after the explosion of the Chernobyl No. 4 reactor, the water ground in the Chernobyl exclusion zone contained 30% as much radioactivity as the surface. So it's probably not a good idea to run into a radiation hot zone to get water, not even from a well unless you have no other choice. If the power is off, electric pumps used for most wells will not work unless, of course, you have a working generator. But hand pumps, wind pumps, and solar electric pumps, often used for farming, will still work. Many of these wells are not certified for human consumption, at least in the United States, but are still safe to drink. If you are unsure about the water, you can always use one of the filtering methods that we will talk about next. There are other water sources that we won't discuss here: fog catch, dew collection, desalination, and distillation, but all are niche and they have their own drawbacks. I'll leave it to you to do the research on those if you think they're a good fit for your situation. I also want to make one last note about safety before we move on. It's a good idea to seek out the permission of the landowner before wandering around someone's property, even to get water. Not only will they have an idea of just how safe the water is, but in places around the world where firearms are prevalent, trespassing can lead to kinetic lead uptake. Okay, now let's consider the different ways to make water safe to drink. Every emergency situation is unique and ever-changing, so it's important to consider what filtering you might need in order to make that water safe. The general rule is, when in doubt, use a filter that can deal with all the threats. First off is the oldest method, boiling. It is a sure way to remove biological contaminants. Bringing the water to a rolling boil for 1 minute will kill everything. The big drawback is that it takes a lot of energy and is slow, since you have to heat the water and then also wait for it to cool. It's also ineffective against toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, and radiological threats. Up next is iodine, whether the liquid or tablet form. It is somewhat effective at removing biological threats and will readily eliminate bacteria and viruses. However, it is only marginally effective at eliminating Giardia and ineffective against Cryptosporidium. It is also ineffective against toxins, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, and radiological threats. Also, be aware that water temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius or 68 degrees Fahrenheit will significantly increase the time it takes to disinfect the water. If you're using a 2% tincture of iodine, add 5 drops to a liter of clean water or 10 drops to the water if it's cloudy or colored. Mix and wait for at least 30 minutes before you drink it. While there is no set amount of time for how long you can safely use iodine to treat water, experts generally don't recommend more than 3 weeks at a time. Bleach is similar to iodine and will readily eliminate bacteria and viruses. It is ineffective against Cryptosporidium and is somewhat less effective against Giardia than iodine is. Also, like other forms of chemical disinfection, it is ineffective against toxins, chemicals, pharmaceuticals, heavy metals, or radiological threats. Water temperatures below 20 degrees Celsius, or again 68 degrees Fahrenheit, will significantly increase the time it takes to disinfect the water. Using a 6% to 8% solution of non-scented bleach, add 2 drops to a liter of water, or 4 drops if the water is cloudy. Wait 30 minutes before using it, but unlike iodine, bleach is considered safe for long-term use. It is also possible to purchase a portable chlorine generator that will create a dose of bleach solution using table salt and battery power. This device is a convenient and portable way to quickly disinfect water using an easily stored and acquired mineral. Chlorine dioxide is also an option and is usually sold in tablet form. It is effective against viruses, bacteria, and giardia, and is mostly effective at 99.3% against cryptosporidium as long as the water is pre-filtered to remove any turbidity. It is ineffective against toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, and radiological threats. Like iodine and bleach, cooler water temperatures means it takes longer to work before the water is safe to drink. However, it does work better at cooler temperatures, retaining effectiveness as low as 10 degrees Celsius or about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Hollow fiber membrane filters are a popular option. They're light, easy to use, and work without needing to remember information about how many drops in so much water for so long. Good brands are effective against bacteria, giardia, cryptosporidium, but not viruses. They are not reliable in filtering out pharmaceuticals, toxins, or chemicals, and will not filter out heavy metals. They are decently effective at removing radioactive contamination, but only because they are able to filter out all but the largest particles of the radioactive fallout. One downside is that they cannot be allowed to freeze or they will become ruined. This type of filter can be improvised using natural materials to the same effect. More on that in a bit. Reverse osmosis is as close to a single filter solution that you can get. It is effective against all biological threats and is reasonably effective at removing pharmaceuticals, toxins, heavy metals, and almost all radiological threats. It could even make pool water safe if you could find a way to run the pool water through it. The downside is that it requires a lot of pressure to work. Hand pump versions require a lot of time and energy and have extremely low output with continuous use, producing about 6 gallons per day. Using powered pumps speeds that up, but requires a lot of electricity or fuel to run. And unfortunately, electricity and fuel are often the first things to go in an emergency situation. On a very positive note, this is the only method on this list that is effective at making salt water drinkable when it is set up for it. Activated charcoal is great at removing toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, and is reasonably good at removing radiological contamination. Unfortunately, it is completely ineffective against biological threats. Activated charcoal stores almost indefinitely in an airtight container and does not need to stay in a climate-controlled area. It's also great for air filtration, think gas masks, so be sure to keep plenty available. Remember that this is not the charcoal from your backyard fire. And while it is possible to make the activated version at home using household ingredients, that would be a topic for another video. Portable UV lights designed for water treatment are highly effective against biological contaminants. Commercial versions will eliminate viruses, bacteria, giardia, and cryptosporidium in just a couple of minutes. Studies suggest that UV is also effective at breaking down toxins from algae, though personally I would still get my water from somewhere else since these devices haven't been tested or designed from that application. UV is not effective at removing pharmaceuticals, toxins, chemicals, heavy metals, or radiological threats, and it only works in clear water, so a good pre-filter is required. Ceramic filters are one of the oldest methods of filtering water. Pot-type filters date back to the Victorian era, and modern ceramic pot versions are decently effective, low cost, and simple enough that a skilled craftsman can produce them locally. These versions can vary in quality, but are shown to significantly reduce the risk of disease, starting at about 50% reduction, with higher quality control getting better results. They generally last more than a year before needing to be replaced, with better quality versions significantly giving longer filter life. This type of filter is effective against bacteria, giardia, and cryptosporidium, but is ineffective against viruses, toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, or heavy metals. It will remove all but the smallest particles of radioactive contamination. The second type of ceramic filter are replaceable combination filters. These are the kind that most people in developed countries are referring to when they talk about the ceramic filters. These are typically a hollow ceramic cylinder filled with activated charcoal and other agents used to remove additional contaminants. They are effective against biological threats and can remove most toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, and radioactive contaminants. This type of filter has two major drawbacks. The first is that it is difficult to know when you've reached the end of its effective life, and when you do, contaminants will increasingly start to slip into your drinking water. The second is their fragility. They must not freeze, and rough handling can cause undetectable cracks to form, allowing contaminants to pass through unfiltered. So with the pre-made filter options out of the way, next I want to show you 2 ways to improvise water disinfection during an emergency situation when you might not have anything. In 2013, researchers at MIT demonstrated that a very effective filter could be made using cuttings from certain plants. This is basically a natural version of a hollow fiber membrane filter. Using nothing more than a freshly cut branch from a conifer, fruit tree, or grapevine, you are able to remove bacteria, Giardia, and Cryptosporidium. Just like its factory-made cousin, this can't remove viruses, toxins, pharmaceuticals, or chemicals, but it's decently effective at removing larger particles of radiological contamination. To make this filter, cut a grapevine or conifer branch and bend it so that each end is in a container. Xylem are directional, moving water from the ground upward, so be sure to mark the skyward end by stripping the bark several inches from the end. Place one container higher than the other. The greater the height separation, the better to let gravity work. Tie a piece of string around the two ends of the vine to keep them from springing outward and tipping the containers. Once you have your branches, fill the elevated container with the water to be filtered and put the rootward end into that container. Suck on the skyward end of the vine to prime the system for better output. Once you have water flowing, put the skyward end into the lower pot. Adding more branches will increase the throughput. It's important to note that the branches cannot be allowed to freeze or dry out. If they do, throw them out and cut more. Some setups use a small piece of wood inserted in the end of a plastic tube. I prefer bending the ends between the two containers to eliminate any chance of contaminated water leaking. Plus, this version is much easier to improvise. The second improvised method is solar disinfection, or SODIS as it is known. This method uses UV light from the sun to inactivate pathogens. Take a clear PET bottle like those that many soda and juices come in and fill it with the clearest water you can get. Then set it on its side in direct sunlight for at least 6 hours. This will be enough to inactivate 99.999% of viruses, Giardia, and Cryptosporidium. Placing a piece of aluminum foil underneath the bottle to reflect light back up through will further increase its effectiveness. If the water stays over 50 degrees Celsius while in direct sunlight, this process can be reduced to as little as 1 hour. However, partly cloudy and overcast conditions increase the time needed to 2 days. Once the water is disinfected, it should be used within 24 hours to prevent the microscopic baddies from regrowing to dangerous levels. This doesn't remove toxins, pharmaceuticals, chemicals, heavy metals, or radiological threats. At this point, you will have noticed that few of these methods are completely effective on their own, and those that are have other drawbacks that limit their reliability in an emergency situation. However, it's easy to combine several of these to make a reasonably effective filter without too much effort or expense. So, let's build it. We want something that filters almost all contaminants, has decent water output, is man-portable, and capable of processing thousands of gallons for extended emergencies, doesn't break the bank, and is simple to build and easy to maintain. Start with a large hydration bladder like those used by hikers and attach a hollow fiber membrane filter to the end of the hose. This will be hung or placed on a table so that the hose hangs down and gravity pulls the water through the filter. Put a charcoal pitcher below the filter so that the water flows into the pitcher filter. When you fill the bladder, be sure to get the cleanest water possible to prevent clogging. You can use a pre-filter or improvise one using a clean shirt or coffee filter as needed. The water in the pitcher will be cleaned of everything except those pesky viruses, so to deal with those and to prevent recontamination, either move the water into a clear, sealed container and leave it out in direct sunlight for at least 6 hours, or add the correct dose of bleach and wait 30 minutes. Keep in mind that purpose-built all-in-one filters will be faster and easier to use, so if you can get one, they are better options, but this setup would be adequate for a small group and thousands of gallons. Now that we've covered many of the best ways to decontaminate water, let's talk about a few of the common methods that didn't make the list and why I've added them to my naughty list. First up is potassium permanganate, also known as Condy's crystals. This method of water disinfection dates back to before chlorination and, as best I could find, became popular because of its inclusion in SAS survival kits. However, it is considered ineffective as a disinfectant. Studies have shown that treating water with a dose more concentrated than is recommended for a full 24 hours did not make it safe for drinking. It is also difficult to accurately measure out the tiny amounts needed to mix the solution, and color matching the shades of pink during low light conditions is difficult to impossible. Lastly, it is a strong oxidizer, making it a pain to store even in ideal conditions. For these reasons, I do not recommend potassium permanganate. Calcium hyperchlorite, also commonly known as pool shock or HTH, is another one on our list that seems like a good idea at first. It's effective against most biological threats, and a little bit goes a long way when treating water. It's even listed by the American EPA as a way to disinfect water during an emergency. If you already have some on hand or can easily get some, the solution it makes is just as effective as bleach. But as many people have found out, storing this strong oxidizer is nothing short of a nightmare. A quick internet search will reveal many horror stories of how it destroyed everything nearby. And unless you put in a special order, finding a usable formula off the shelf at a store is almost impossible. Most home pool treatment brands contain other pool chemicals and are good for swimming pools, but that you don't want to ingest. As an example of how difficult it is to source without a special order, I looked up over 50 pool supply stores within an hour's drive, and only one carried the high test formula needed that didn't include any unwanted chemicals. And that was out of stock. But unless you use this for your pool or rotate it regularly, there's another problem. HTH will lose its efficacy over time at a rate of 3 to 5% per year under ideal storage conditions, and much, much faster in less than ideal conditions or when the seal is broken. So after a couple of years in storage or a couple of days after breaking the seal to make that initial batch of liquid bleach, what started out as 70% might only be 60%, or it might be 45%. So because of the difficulties in storage, difficulty sourcing this in an emergency, and uncertainty of its potency, this makes my naughty list. Before we move on, I want to make a note that this recommendation is for the average person using small amounts of HTH at a time. If your plan involves storing and or treating large amounts of water, then this is absolutely an option. But that's another video, and it's beyond the basics we're talking about today. Another on our naughty list is citrus, whether juice or extract. Studies have shown that this stuff is, at best, okay at removing sedimentation and has an effect about the same as using a couple of fine coffee filters. Don't use it. Just don't. And this next one I've seen touted by many self-proclaimed experts, and it even makes it into a few survival manuals. It's the grass, sand, rocks, and charcoal filter. This does a decent job removing dirt, but that's it. It's a decent pre-filter, but you will need another way to make the water safe to drink. In conclusion, we've learned that the water that we drink is even more vulnerable now than it has been historically. The traditional biological threats persist, but also toxic chemicals, pharmaceuticals, heavy metal leaching, and nuclear contamination. Even if the water we have available can't be made drinkable, there's still many uses for it, like bathing and cleaning. That will help us to conserve the drinking water that we do have. You should have at least 43 liters or 12 US gallons per person as a 72-hour supply of drinking water and more for your pets. You should have a simple portable filter system ready to make water drinkable, and it should be able to make thousands of gallons. We learned that just because someone on the internet or even an expert said it, that doesn't make it true. Always check your facts, cite your sources, and be ready to help each other. Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments. While you're doing that, go ahead and tell us what you found that works and what tips and tricks you have learned for making water drinkable. With that, hopefully you have a better understanding of the threats around water and the ways to deal with them. Until next time, don't just get ready, live ready.